Thank you. So first of all, it's a real honor and a delight to be here, and I actually intend absolutely no disrespect to the European Parliament to say that I'm going to focus on the Commission, actually, and what the Commission can do. Partly because as someone who works in law, the Commission is supposed to be the enforcer of the treaties and the enforcer of EU law, and one of the questions is how they do it in the case of Hungary. Now, those of you who follow Hungarian developments know very well that there's plenty to complain about in Hungary. The problem is that many of the things that one can complain about in Hungary are not so clearly violations of EU law, because EU law is not about everything, it's only about some things. And I was reminded recently that when Viktor Orban was first in the parliament, the Hungarian parliament, in the 1990s, one of the things he did was to chair the European Affairs Committee of the European Parliament, of the Hungarian Parliament, sorry. And in that capacity, I think he learned very well what's EU law. And so as a result, as the Hungarian government has designed this illiberal, or I might say autocratic system, it has taken great care to avoid stepping on EU law, which is really extraordinary. Those of you who know this up close also know that the circle of lawyers that kind of invented the legal structure that cements this autocratic government were also extremely good comparative lawyers. So one of the things they did was they borrowed the worst practices of every EU member state and put them together in a package. In some of my writings, I've called this the Frankenstate, after the Frankenstein state. If you remember the Victor Frankenstein, who was the name of the creator of the monster, not the monster, this monster was created by sewing together a lot of body parts of what had been normal people. And it was the combination of the normal body parts in that sense that created the monster, right? So this has been Orban's strategy in doing this with laws, taking sort of the German system for drawing districts, in which they're not equal, with first past the post system from Britain, and you can go on and on and on through this. Now, that strategy of developing a kind of new legal framework for Hungary has made it very hard to attack from the EU for two reasons. One is that much of this is just not EU law, and the second is the parts that are EU law look like someplace else. So every time you single out one element of the Hungarian system, the Hungarian government can say, why are you picking on us when there are 3 other countries that do the exact same thing, right? So it's that combination of things that's caused me to actually try to come up with a new proposal for what the EU can do. And this is where I want to focus a bit on what the Commission can do, because the Commission has the responsibility and the obligation, and not just the option, to enforce the EU treaties and to enforce EU law. So I think the first thing to say is that one way to focus on what Hungary has done is to say that Hungary is really alone in the EU in the pattern of violations and the pattern of problems that it has. And it seems to me that those of us who are interested in trying to challenge what is happening in Hungary need to always emphasize the pattern. Because, like I said, every time you criticize Hungary for one thing, they point to the 3 other countries that do that. And not only does it defend Hungary, but it makes those 3 other countries nervous. And it means that you lose their support for acting in the EU because they can see that they're next. So in order to get an action going against Hungary, it seems to me that it's wise to focus on the fact that it's a Frankenstate. It's this combination of things. And so as a result, I'm thinking that when you look at how the Commission enforces EU law, what they tend to do is to narrow a complaint to as small a thing as they can file. And they file an infringement action on one small thing. Okay? And so this is the first thing I think we need to try to discuss with the Commission, that if you focus on one small thing, you will always miss the point in Hungary. Both because one small thing is just one small thing in a big picture. Second of all, because one small thing, even if the Commission wins when it takes an action to the Court of Justice, means that you get some small compliance, which usually means not much in terms of changing the fundamental structure on the ground. So what I proposed is that the Commission should think about doing in this area of sort of political compliance what it's already done in the field of common market, which is to say, to take a series of related complaints and bundle them together into what I'm calling now a systemic infringement action, where you say that the way in which Hungary is violating EU law is by having not just one objectionable law or one objectionable practice, but a family of practices, a set of practices that reinforce each other to create a violation bigger than the sum of the parts. Okay? Now let me give you one example. When Hungary lowered the judicial retirement age, the Commission was actually very active and very creative. They immediately brought this expedited action to the Court of Justice against Hungary for lowering the judicial retirement age. I might say that the reason for lowering the judicial retirement age in Hungary was to get rid of the entire top leadership of the judiciary. So this government could replace 25% of the Supreme Court, a majority of the court presidents throughout the country, and so on. It was really to eliminate the senior-most leadership group in the ordinary judiciary. The Commission springs into action. Something's wrong with this. What's wrong with this? They decide on age discrimination. And they expedite because the government's firing judges. Like as they do this, the ECJ speeds up, hands Hungary a complete defeat. And then the Commission starts to think about, okay, so what is compliance? And at first Viviana Reding says compliance is when they've reinstated all the judges. And then, of course, what the Hungarian government says is, well, we've already replaced all the judges. Do you want us to fire the new ones? It's as if the Commission never thought ahead to that, right? In the end, what happened was that the Hungarian government paid compensation to the judges for discrimination, which is what you do in discrimination cases if you can't restore people to their jobs. The Commission had to admit defeat in some sense because the Hungarian government had complied, but the judiciary has all been taken over, right? So that's what the Commission normally does. So how else could they have done it? Well, the reason why we know the lowering of the judicial retirement age was a problem was because it happened at the same time that the government changed the system for appointing judges. So they created now this new office of this new National Judicial Office. It's staffed by one person who is a former judge but is a political official who has the sole power to hire, fire, demote, promote, discipline, and assign, for a while, to assign concrete cases to judges. One person. Okay, now when you combine the judicial retirement age with this system for appointing judges, then you begin to realize this was not just a discrimination problem, right? It really affects the independence of the entire Hungarian judiciary. And you combine that with the fact that they tailored the requirements for the president of the Hungarian Supreme Court so that the sitting president became ineligible to stay in his office. He's already won his court at the European Court of Human Rights. And you can go on and on. There were a set of things the government did to take control of the ordinary judiciary. And if the Commission were to take all of those things together and to say that's the problem, is the independence of the judiciary, it would be much harder for the Orban government to avoid compliance in a way that, they would have to change something to get at the independence of the judiciary. So then you say, well, okay, so how do they bring that? Because independence of the judiciary is weirdly not a named feature of EU law. So there's rule of law in Article 2. And when I first started making this proposal, I used to say that, why can't the Court of Justice enforce Article 2 directly? And the answer is, believe me, they don't want to do that. So how else do you bring this? Well, one possibility is to raise this under Article 4.3 of the Treaty of the European Union, which is also called the loyalty principle, which is the principle that says that no member state may systematically thwart the operation of EU law on their territory. And certainly since the national judiciary is the enforcer, the first line of defense for the enforcement of EU law, taking over and infringing the independence of the judiciary is certainly something that ought to count under the very now quite large and detailed jurisprudence of the Court of Justice under Article 4.3, that this would count as a kind of systemic infringement. Okay? So you start to get the idea. This is a short presentation. I could go on about other options, and I would love to hear your ideas about options for systemic infringement actions. But the idea is to take a pattern of practice, bring it under either some concrete area of EU law if we can find it, but certainly Article 4.3 is available. And then the point of bringing it in that fashion is not just to, call the thing by its name, which is important, but to leverage a certain kind of compliance that would be much harder for the Hungarian government to evade, because you would have named the generic problem and not just some tiny thing. It's weird. It's weird, but it's harder to avoid or harder to nitpick compliance when it's about a principle like this. Okay, but here's another reason for doing this. Some of you may remember there was this moment when now First Vice President Mr. Timmermans led 4 foreign ministers in a letter to the Commission, in which he and his compatriots said, you know, I understand that we actually can't force countries to be things they don't want to be, but at least we shouldn't have to pay for it. He said it more diplomatically, but he sort of raised the possibility that cutting EU funds to systematically violating states was something that at least ought to be on the table. Now, when he made that proposal, he made it disconnected from any other kind of sanctioning mechanism, and I think as he made the proposal, it was really not particularly workable in the current structures of EU sanctioning. So what I'm actually proposing to do is to tie a way to cut EU funds to this systemic infringement action. Okay? And how to do that? Well, if a country is in non-compliance, and here, remember, I'm trying to get compliance to be really living up to the values of the EU, right? If a country is in systemic non-compliance with a systemic infringement, actually even now, if a country is in non-compliance with any judgment of the ECJ, the Commission can go back to the ECJ under Article 260 of the TFEU and say, we need to be able to assess a monetary penalty. In fact, the exact language of Article 260 is, if the court finds that the member state concerned has not complied with its judgment, it may impose a lump sum or penalty payment on it. That's the language. So why read the language? Well, right now, the way 260 has always been interpreted is that the government in question, the non-compliant government, is fined. And then the EU waits around for the money to come from the member state. But if you'll notice the way that thing is phrased, it doesn't say the money has to come from the member state's treasury. So why can't the EU take the fine as a deduction from the funds that the EU would otherwise pay to the member state in the amount of the fine that they would normally charge the country? Okay, and let's not be punitive about it. Let's do in this case exactly what happens in other 260 actions, which is that the country is fined. They very rarely actually pay, but they sort of accumulate these astronomical sums, and then when they comply, all is forgiven. So let's do the same with 260, right? So you dock you take away the funds, but you suspend them until such time as the country comes into compliance, and then you can pay the funds, right? This would be a way to cut EU funds within the structure of the current treaties without requiring treaty change, and in a way that I think people would pay attention to. As you heard from our colleague Mr. Javor earlier today, EU funds are a very important source of funds for the party itself in Hungary. And if EU funds could be suspended, this would certainly get the attention of the governing party. Ideally, you'd like them to come into compliance, but it would also, of course, generate some problems for the party back home, which may in fact might have a good effect on getting them to come back into EU line. So I mention all of this basically as a way of saying that I think the Commission, within its current powers, by doing something it's already done, it's already grouped together different practices and rules to do these actions, these infringement actions, in the area of common market infringements. Why not do it in this area as well? It gives them more leverage on compliance, and crucially, if you follow my last proposal to tie this to a proposal to cut EU funds, could actually finally provide a legal way for the EU to do something about the problem in a way that would have an impact back home in Hungary. By the way, I say this with some regret, because I know that if EU funds were cut to Hungary, this is right now about the only source of incoming public investment. I think this is really a last resort. I don't propose this with any happiness, but it seems to me that given that everything else hasn't worked yet, at least the threat of this, because it would be so serious, might actually encourage the government of Hungary to finally rejoin the EU. Thank you.